In our next step of understanding the decision-making process, we're going to be looking at advantages and disadvantages. So just like with identifying alternatives, it may seem like this is something that we just do instinctively, but what we want to do is teach our students to be good at decision-making. So we're going to want to focus on how to do this, and an important part of that is being able to understand and recognize advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives that they are evaluating. So as we look at this, we're going to use some stories to tell these very important ways that we can do this. We're going to have some objectives here. We're going to be able to define what advantages and disadvantages are. We're going to look at different animals, different animal body parts, and different kinds of food through stories. So by definition, an advantage is a good consequence of an alternative, and a disadvantage is a bad thing about an alternative. So for us, this might seem very basic, but don't forget our students, we want to teach them sequentially, and we want to put this all together into this powerful ability to make decisions using really solid economic reasoning. So as we're talking about our goal, we want to make sure we're setting this up. This is our decision-making process. We start with our goal. We've talked a lot about what goals are. We've helped our students identify goals through literature. Then we're going to talk about the resources available to meet our goal. We've talked about that too. We've identified resources through literature. And we've talked to our students about how their most important resource is their human capital, since that's the one they have the most control over. Then we talked about alternatives, identifying alternatives, knowing that when a decision is being made, there are alternatives, and that we don't reuse the word need because the word need implies a lack of alternatives. So once we've gotten this far, with the weighing of alternatives, we want to make sure that our students recognize that alternatives have advantages and disadvantages. So we can do this pretty clearly through some stories. This decision-making apron is something that you could use as a tool. This is an apron, of course, that you probably cannot buy easily. There is a possibility you can get one from the California Council on Economic Education, but more than likely you would use this in the form of a decision-making grid. In our C3 project for this course, you have a decision-making grid that has the same setup as the decision-making apron, but this is a wonderful tool for illustrating decision-making. And this can be used to tell stories in the classroom. You can use this in a ton of different ways. The process is the same, whether you use the apron and you tell the story, using the apron and the characters, or whether you use the decision-making grid. But I want you to just notice that the decision-making process is laid out, all of those 5 steps that we've already identified. Identify the goal and the resource used to achieve the goal. Alternative uses of that resource to achieve the goal. We've already talked about how to do those things. And now we're looking at advantages and disadvantages of those alternatives. And you'll notice that the process narrows down to a choice and an opportunity cost, which we'll get to in a moment. So this is the same as the decision-making grid, and a story that we can use to illustrate advantages and disadvantages is I Wish I Had Duck's Feet. This is a very fun Dr. Seuss story that allows you to identify different alternatives. And it's a very fun little rhyming story. And he says, I wish I had duck's feet. And he goes through the advantages and disadvantages of each of these alternatives. So if he has duck's feet, and you can ask your students, there's a tool that you can use and a document that has you set up the advantages and disadvantages of each of these alternatives. So with duck feet, I wish I had duck feet, and this would be great about it. And then he says, but. And then he goes on to describe what typically his mom wouldn't like about it. deer horns. He talks about the advantages and disadvantages of deer horns. The whale spout, what's good and bad about that. The long tail, the elephant nose, the putting it all together into a which, what, who. Great story, great opportunity for your students to identify the advantages and disadvantages of different alternatives. The King, the Mice, and the Cheese, another just fun story and very simple with advantages and disadvantages of several different alternatives to solve the problem of too many mice initially. And it's a fun story, and it's funny actually too. Another great story to illustrate alternatives, Jalapeno Bagels. And this one is a wonderful story about a young person that chooses among different alternatives in his family's bakery to take to school, and goes through the advantages and disadvantages of the different alternatives. So a really wonderful story and appropriate for a lot of different age groups. And I think you'll really like that one. So to go back, in each of the stories, we can see that the alternatives have advantages, and those can be pointed out as the good consequences. And you can discuss these things with your students as you're reading these stories. And it has disadvantages, which are the bad consequences of the alternatives. So in the King, the Mice, and the Cheese, for example, one of the alternatives is lions. And you can see that that's going to have some really negative consequences there. You can see that in Jalapeno Bagels, there's something that he doesn't like so well, and he'll describe that. And in the I Wish I Had Duck Feet story with deer horns, here's a negative consequence or a bad consequence of an alternative. To summarize, when we're making decisions, we choose a goal. We identify the resources available to achieve the goal. We identify alternative uses of the resources to achieve the goal, and the alternatives have advantages and disadvantages. So far we're just working our way through that decision-making process. Remember to connect it back to that decision-making apron and that decision-making grid, which is the paper version of the apron, and we are on our way.